a conversation exploring the curriculum culture wars, please welcome to the stage Kimberlé Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, and Randall Kennedy, a Michael R. Klein professor at Harvard Law School. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Adam Harris.
Hello, everyone. I am honored to be joined by legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum and faculty director of the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies at Columbia Law School. Professor Crenshaw is a pioneering scholar and writer on civil rights, critical race theory, Black feminist legal theory, and race, racism, and the law. In addition to her position at Columbia, she's a distinguished professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor Crenshaw is known for the introduction and development of intersectional theory and intersectional feminism, and she has authored a number of books on the topic. Also joining us today is Randall Kennedy, a Michael R. Klein professor of law at Harvard University. His research focuses on the intersection of racial conflict and legal institutions in American life. He specializes in contracts, freedom of expression, race relations law, civil rights legislation, and the Supreme Court. Professor Kennedy's next book, Say It Loud, on Race, Law, History, and Culture, is a collection of provocative essays exploring the key social justice issues of our time. Professors Crenshaw and Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us today. So, what we've seen over the last couple of years has been a sort of redefinition of critical race theory. But I think that definitions are incredibly important. So Professor Crenshaw, I'm going to go to you first. Can you define for us what critical race theory was and what it has become?
Thank you so much for asking it that way, right? Because it has gone through a redefinition. I would even say a theft of the concept. Critical race theory, properly framed, is a prism. It is a practice. It is a way of interrogating and understanding how and why 60 years after the civil rights movement, we still have predictable inequalities. We still have wealth gaps and health gaps and differences in encounters with police and differences in our encounters in the education system. So critical race theory has been and was a study of the way that law contributes to inequality. So rather than seeing law as a neutral referee, from a critical perspective, we looked at how law actually helped create what we think race is and helped imbue that with material consequences. So race is a fiction, racism is real. Critical race theory studied how law contributed to both of those things.
Mm-hmm. And considering how it has been redefined now, where do you see the sort of current definition of critical race theory in the popular conception?
Well, it is, it's not a secret that those who are attacking critical race theory do so fully aware that what they are trying to do is to recode critical race theory as the thing that makes people feel insecure. It is a container for grievance, many times grievance about loss of dominance, about loss of comfort. Critical race theory has been framed as effectively an assault, an attack on individuals, on children, rather than a study of history, a study of policies and practices, rather than a way of understanding why we have to address our racial history in order to claim a racial future. So for the most part, I would say that one can look directly at what some of the organizations and foundations coming after critical race theory say they're trying to do. They say they're trying to sow dissension and dissatisfaction with public schools as a way of attacking public education. There's no secret about what they're after. The real question is why it has been successful. And I would say one of the reasons it's successful is that there is discomfort talking about race. There's a convergence between people who want to use color blindness to take us back to the past and those who use color blindness as a way of circumventing the past in our hopes for the future.
And so, Professor Kennedy, you've been a critic of critical race theory in the past. What do you make of the current conversation around the curriculum, around kind of the way that people are seeing the world?
Well, as my colleague just put it, critical race theory, I put it in quotation marks, has become a boogeyman. And it's a way for people to attack what they perceive to be progressive beliefs with respect to the race question. And we've seen this before. I mean, this is not unprecedented. In the 1950s and 1960s, Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King Jr. and the people who were propelling the Second Reconstruction were called what? They were called communists. And they were attacked. And they were attacked in very similar ways to the way in which critical race theory is being attacked now. So, there's when critical race theory is mentioned, it seems to me people ought to put a quotation marks around it. It is made to be something unattractive. It's made to be something stupid. The whole point of it is to gather momentum against anything that is viewed as racially progressive. And that's what it seems to me is going on here.
And of course, there are really practical stakes to this at this point, like really kind of on the ground stakes. In Texas, of course, which has an anti, quote unquote CRT law, educators have reported being confused about what is and off limits to teach, in part because the laws are written in such a way that is so vague. What are the sort of democratic risks? Are there democratic risks to this sort of boogeyman that has been created around critical race theory?
Well, of course. I mean, there really is no daylight between the attack on democracy and the attack on anti-racism. Ours is a country that had to fight hard and long. It's an incomplete fight to make us a real functioning multiracial democracy. The way that we have to grapple with our past to do that is exactly what those who are attacking critical race theory and attacking democracy want. I mean, it is not an accident that the same people who are perpetuating the big lie are the same people who are creating this manufactured moral panic around anti-racism and education. They're the same people who framed the George Floyd days of reckoning as civil disruption to the point of bringing our democracy to the brink. Now, of course, what really brought our democracy to the brink was the assault on the Capitol, an assault that was carried out under a Confederate flag, along with a set of ideas that this country was being stolen from us. That was not a colorblind framing, that was not a colorblind mobilization, and it wasn't an unprecedented one, as much as people say, this is not who we are. Saying that proves what the problem is, because that is who we've been. We are a country that struggled with democracy. We are a country that had coups in the past. We are a country that never really reckoned with what brought us to the brink before. So the connection between anti-democratic forces and white supremacist forces are deeply interwoven historically and now. The problem is if we don't have a lens to see it, if we don't have comfort in talking about it, if we can't really do the reporting that's necessary to understand it, the saying was the past is not even the past. That rings true in this particular moment. So there are high stakes at being able to connect the dots and fight both of these things, understanding both of these things simultaneously.
Absolutely. And I have a follow-up to that. Professor Kennedy, I want to ask you the same question. What are the sort of democratic stakes to this kind of current conversation?
Huge stakes, and that's why everyone should be deeply concerned. Whatever one's views are of critical race theory without the quotation marks. I mean, there are people who, there are debates, there are reasonable debates that go on with respect to various tenets of critical race theory. But everybody should be concerned about the effort to censor, to outlaw critical race theory. And, democracy. An integral part of democracy, any decent democracy should have built into it a protection for thinking, protection for writing, protection for teaching, protection for listening. That is part of democracy. And when those things are attacked, as they are under attack now, in lots of different ways. You mentioned laws, and obviously laws are important, but it's far deeper than that. If you know that you're going to be under attack from your principal, if you know that in various ways your career is going to be undermined, if you know that if you say certain things, your very livelihood is going to be put into jeopardy, that's going to chill people. And we can see chilling happening all across the United States. And again, I would say that everyone, wherever your ideological position, should be concerned about that, because ultimately, if critical race theory can be outlawed and can be ousted from the public realm, well, other ideas can be attacked in that way as well. So everyone should be concerned about this.
Absolutely. And you've both talked about how it's not necessarily unprecedented, right? That we have historical sort of analogs for kind of what is going on at this moment. But there's this notion, right, that discussions of racism and structural racism are in effect anti-white because they challenge sort of mythology of American exceptionalism, right? And Professor Crenshaw, I want to ask, what do you make of that idea? Can you sort of expand on that idea?
Well, I see in it a brilliant effort to use the frame of reverse discrimination and now apply it to education and to ideas. What a lot of people don't know, there's legislation that tries to restrict or limit education about race and racism in almost half the states. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, that legislation bans divisive concepts, right? Now, when you live in a society that has at its foundation enslavement, appropriation of land, colonization of black women's wombs as the production of the primary property that allowed us to expand, dealing with that foundational dimension of American society is inherently a divisive set of conversations, but it doesn't make it an illegitimate set of conversations. That's what's different about a democracy. You understand your way through engagement, through lifting up that which people may feel uncomfortable about, but yet that is what's required and that's what's responsible. So when I hear the framing of it as being anti-white, as Randy said, it just takes me back to many other moments in history where racial progress was framed as anti-white. Let us never forget that the freedom riders and the young people who sat in the lunch counters, they were called divisive. What they were calling for was called discrimination against people who owned businesses. They said to a point, being forced to serve you violates my civil rights. Being forced to allow my kids to go to school with your kids violates my rights of disassociation. So throughout our history, there's always been the capacity to make the argument that forward momentum, progression in terms of racial integration, racial progress, violates pre-existing rights. The question is to interrogate, as Charles Black said, do you have those rights in the first place? Do you have the right to exclude? Do you have a right to an education that doesn't deal with the reality that our country is based on? That's what the debate is, and what this is an attempt to do is make it impossible and unspeakable to even talk about these things.
You know, again, if we look at our history, we see that there have been massive attacks on racist attacks on freedom of expression. We can go back to the slavery period. In fact, the most comprehensive attack on intellectual freedom was in the slavery era, with laws that prohibited slaves from being taught to read or write. I mean, that was, think about that. I mean, now we're talking about censoring people, but if you're censoring somebody, they have the means of speaking. You're just saying, if you speak, we're going to punish you. Back then, the effort was, let's not allow these people even to read, write. Abolitionists were viciously attacked in the antebellum period. Again, in the Second Reconstruction, suppression all over the place. And then in our own time, we're seeing it. Now, there is one thing that maybe we can take some solace from, and that is that every time there has been this effort to repress the people who were trying to mobilize racial progress, every time there has been a reaction against it. So, you know, that's right, abolitionists were mobbed, abolitionists were killed, and that led to, in the first Reconstruction, a real attentiveness to freedom of expression. In the Second Reconstruction, if one thinks about the liberalization of libel law, if one thinks about protection of mass dissent, if one thinks about organizational privacy, those were all things, you know, progressive reforms that were in reaction against repression. We'll see if it happens this time. I'm hoping we'll see it this time.
Ever the optimist, Randy.
Ever the optimist, yes.
Well, actually, and speaking of, you know, you were talking about how enslaved people were barred from learning to read, right? You're from South Carolina, right? First, slave code that effectively banned slaves from being able to read was in South Carolina in 1740. So, considering, you know, the sort of illiberal move towards book bans now, why hasn't there been a more forceful response from those who pushed back on book bans and sort of illiberalization of democracy prior, as in this kind of current moment? Can you sort of speak to what prevents people from pushing back against
our
actual
conversation
book
that
bans?
I've asked you many times before?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think it should be understood that, you know, there are people who are pushing back. It takes time. It takes forums like this to educate and to prompt. And I think we're going to have to continue to educate and to prompt and to urge people to speak up and to tell people, hey, listen, you know, you don't speak up. It may be these people, you know, today. It'll be you tomorrow. So we better, you know, get out and make our voices heard. I think another thing that's going on also is that, you know, there are people who have been critical of critical race theory. And I think some of the folks in that camp have been, that's inhibited them. Their problems with critical race theory, or what they think is critical race theory, because a lot of people, even in the academy, who, you know, talk about critical race theory, they too have a stereotyped, narrow, you know, vision of it. And I think some of them have probably tried to sit out this struggle because they didn't want to, you know, be seen as, you know, coming as being on the same side as critical race theorists. I think that's a big mistake, and I hope that as time goes on, people will rectify that mistake.
Absolutely.
So we have this conversation a lot, right? And I agree. I would say that one of the reasons that there's so much sluggishness is because the left, and I would say the left is everybody other than the right at this point. I think in society now that's kind of what it is. There are questions about, well, I see that they're trying to burn this building, but what's the building for? Who's in it? What are they doing? Whereas the other side is like, all right, critical race theory is what we're after. Okay, bring out the pitchforks. We're there. So there's an asymmetry, I think, in the response, largely because of that. And here's my other thing. I do think that there is a way in which mainstream punditry and media participate in, unwittingly, in a strategy to create a false controversy. Then it becomes visual. You see all the people going to the school boards. And so then, the reporters come in and do a both sides kind of thing. And that is laundering a false set of stories, misinformation laundering. And we have to figure out how not to do that. What are the questions that should be asked? Not, do you really hate little white kids? That's ridiculous. But one could ask, what is behind this? Critical race theory has been around for 40 years. Why is it suddenly the threat to Western civilization that I'm hearing on this network that it is? Asking who's behind it, what's the money behind it, what are the objectives that people have said, we're going after public education. That ability to really take on what's happening, I think we're behind the ball on it, partly because we don't really know how to talk about race and white supremacy in a comfortable way. So colorblindness becomes the default. We're not really even able to talk about January 6th in a fully robust way. So this, I think, is a moment where we have to grow up real quickly and be literate about race and racism, because our democracy really depends on us doing so, and doing so really quickly.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll actually wrap it there for today. Professors Crenshaw and Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.